Hello, welcome back. We are going to continue the work that we did earlier this week with Unit 4, Lesson 3, now here in Unit 4, Lesson 4. Remember that we're looking at the power of descriptive language, and especially this week we're focusing on that analysis assessment standard where we're being asked to interpret imagery and word choice in terms of the setting. So we're going to continue that with the same example that we looked at last time. Last time we read an excerpt from 1984, and then your job was to go through and find examples of imagery and diction or word choice about the setting and boil them down to adjectives that really kind of summarize the culmination of that imagery and diction. So the example, this is just a reminder of what we've looked at already in this kind of series of lessons. But the example that I showed you took just a few samples from early on in the reading. I showed you how the word escape and heavy and the imagery, it was a bright cold day in April and the hallway smelt of cabbage and old rag mats, could potentially be boiled down to one adjective, which I said, I thought the word bleak was a good adjective to use. Now, you may have chosen a different adjective if you had taken those four examples. Your job was to then go through and find your own examples and figure out your own adjectives. And probably your adjectives, hopefully your adjectives were different than mine, maybe more complex than mine. And we'll be going back to those in a few minutes, but this is just a reminder of where we've already been. So I also want to just kind of review with you now that you've had some time to work with it. One of the things that I suggested that you do was to think about how imagery is creating the setting. Those are things like sight, sound, taste, smells, touch, and how diction was doing the same thing, specific word choices that help us understand the nature of the setting. So I'm just going to show you, like, if this were class and you were highlighting, this might be what your highlights looked like. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but you could, pause and look at them. I've got, so I've put yellow highlights are examples of imagery that I found, and it's probably not all of the examples of imagery, but I tried to get a good selection. And blue highlights are examples of diction. And again, not I mean, every word has been chosen, right? Like we could highlight every word, but I was trying to, highlight just a few, just to not overwhelm you. So if we look at, we've got these examples of the bright cold day, right? Like that physical sensation, that imagery, clock striking 13, which sounds a little weird, right? Like 13, clocks don't strike 13, but we can hear that. The swirl of gritty dust, maybe we can see the dust swirling, but we might also kind of feel it, against our skin or getting into our eyes. The smell of boiled cabbages. We've got the face of this man with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features who's, staring at us all the time, like that. That's both a visual, but also a kind of a, that physical sensation of being watched, and the slowness of Winston's movements and his tiredness, the eyes that follow you, again, that physical sensation of feeling followed. And then we've got these words: nuzzled, escape, vile, heavy, hate weak, contrived, all of which are kind of negatively connotated words that help to create that bleak feeling that I was talking about on the previous slide. If we look forward, again, the oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror, is this image of this thing on a wall. It's the telescreen. They tell us later on. They describe Winston as a smallish, frail figure. This is more character stuff, but I thought it was interesting. Kind of in these giant overalls, the way his hair is or his face is kind of rough and coarse. Those are diction choices. We can see that, right? His frailness, his meagerness, the dullness of this world, right? Like just the, again, bleak word choice, bleak imagery. The world looks cold. We can feel the cold. We can see it. Whirling dust and torn paper again, feeling and sight. No color in anything, the draining of color, the dark eyes looking deep into Winston as a physical sensation, the poster flapping, commanding, fitfully, harsh, plastered, right? All of these are things that are, in my opinion, helping to create that bleakness that I was talking about. Now, your job in these, some of you probably did, and obviously I'm recording this before you've done the work, so I don't know yet. But your job was to go through and find examples like these. Did you match my examples exactly? I don't know, and it really doesn't matter that much whether you did or didn't. I'm just showing you examples. What's more important is that you're realizing how much imagery and how much diction there is, and then being able to move beyond that so that you can then go back and figure out those adjectives that really describe this world. So it's not just a bleak world, although bleak is one word that you could use to describe it, right? It is a world where lots of things, where lots of words could describe it. So what I'd like to do today is to go back to that work that you've done and to extend it a little bit more, because you can't just say, well, look, I looked at the imagery, I looked at the diction, and I came up with a word, and la-di-da, the end, right? Like that's not the end of the story. That's not the end of our ability to think about this. And I'd like you to take some notes on this slide, because this is the really important stuff. This is the stuff that once you've read a document and you've noticed the important things about the document, this is where you really start doing some thinking about it. So we want to be able to take our interpretation to the next level, to really be able to analyze what we're learning, right? So let's walk through this. Let's stick with my example for now. I have these four. Again, you should have more, but I'm sticking with mine so that I'm not doing too much work for you. These four examples that I started with on my web: the escape for diction, heavy for diction, for imagery, the bright cold day in April, and the hallway smelling of cabbage and old rag mats. So we start there, and I go on to this word bleak, right? All four of these things that I've noticed are helping to create this bleak world of 1984. I've included a picture of one of the covers of the book so that you can kind of see a little bit about what the book might be about, especially if you haven't read it, which I assume most of you haven't, although you should. It's a good book. I recommend it. I actually just read it with my AP classes. You can see the big brother face on that. You can see Winston as well, kind of sticking out. You can see the lack of color and things like that. So there's some bleakness in that cover as well. Now, what do we do with that? Because eventually we're going to have to turn it into some kind of thesis, and we're going to have to say something about it, right? Like it's going to have to turn it into an essay. So where do we go from here? Okay, fine. The diction and the imagery creates this bleak world. Well, what we could do is write a thesis that looks something like this. So we say, since George Orwell uses diction and imagery to create a bleak setting, so there's our, right, like that's the beginning of the thesis, right? That's all the work we've done up to this point. Readers of this introduction may be overcome with feelings of blank, right? So now we're starting to get more into the interpretation, the analysis. Okay. Imagery and diction create this sensation, and that's bringing up these emotions in the reader. So that's one step beyond where we've gone, which is great, but there's still another step that we can take. And so that's the third part of the thesis, the therefore part of the thesis. And therefore expect the character of Winston to experience blank. So if we're noticing diction and imagery, and it's creating this kind of world that brings up these emotions in us, then how then do we take that and apply that to the story? What's going to happen in the story? What kind of lesson might we learn from the story? What kind of things might happen in the story? And that's where our thinking, our interpretation, our analytical skills really come into play. Now, obviously, there's a whole novel that comes after this, right? So we're only interpreting the imagery and the diction from the first page or so of the book. The essay that you write after reading the entire novel might be completely different than this. We don't know, but that's not the task that we're being asked to do at the moment. So I just want to point out to you that this thesis still has 3 parts, like the thesis statements that we've practiced before. We've got the since, we've got the basically then, which is the readers of this introduction may be overcome with feelings of blank, and we have the therefore. So what that does for us is it gives us a very clear direction for an essay that we might write. Now, this is a basic essay outline. Essays get far more complex than this, but since we're still kind of we're still practicing basics of essays. We're getting better at it, but we're still we're not ready to do all the really fancy stuff that will come in later classes, and that's fine. But when I look at this this thesis, I can say, okay, it very clearly implies to me that this is a paper that's going to have 4 to 5 parts. I'm going to tell you how it breaks down to 4 parts for me. Obviously, the first part's going to need to be the introduction with the thesis, but then what I would do with this is a little bit different than what I would have done with previous thesis statements, where the first and second part of the thesis had their own body paragraphs. In this case, what I'm going to actually do is combine the first and second part of the thesis to create 2 different body paragraphs. So body paragraph 1, I would take and turn into a paragraph about diction and how diction is creating that bleakness that I'm talking about. I would then go forward and talk about how the diction and the bleakness it's creating is affecting the reader's emotion, which I've described in the second part of the thesis. I would then do basically the same thing with body paragraph 2, but instead of focusing on diction, I would focus on imagery and showing how imagery is also creating that bleakness and is also feeding into those emotions from the reader. So 2 very similar paragraphs, but those paragraphs are covering the first 2 parts of the thesis together there. I would save the final part of the thesis. Now this is where it gets a little tricky. I'm going to recommend just doing this with a conclusion. Some of you may choose to do a third body paragraph and do something else with the conclusion, but I'm not going to go into that right now. I would save this last part of the thesis for the conclusion, and I would use the prediction that I'm making as kind of that wrap up, like bigger thought that would help me bookend my my short little essay that I would be writing here. Obviously, you would have evidence to back these things up. You would need to elaborate on how the evidence is creating that bleakness and how it's leading us to these specific emotions. So this is a very basic outline that that just kind of helps you see where we could go with all of this thinking. And the short practice that I'm going to ask you to do today is to simply take the work that you were supposed to have done in the previous lesson and now turn it into your own thesis statement. I've given you kind of the model of the thesis with some blank spots if you need a starting point for that. And that's the work that I'll ask you to complete today.